Scott here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. In the summer of 1944, a hand-picked group of young GIs landed in France to conduct a secret mission. From Normandy to the Rhine, the 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Ghost Army, conjured up phony convoys, phantom divisions, inflatable tanks, and make-believe headquarters to fool the enemy about the strength and location of American units. Every move they made was top secret, and their story was hushed up for decades after the war's end. The unit's official U.S. Army history noted that its complement was more theatrical than military, and it was like a traveling roadshow that went up and down the front lines impersonating the real-life fighting units. They pulled off 21 different deceptions and are credited with saving thousands of lives through stagecraft and sleight of hand. They threw themselves into their impersonations, sometimes setting up phony command posts and masquerading as generals. They frequently put themselves in danger and suffered casualties as a result. After holding Patton's line along the Moselle, they barely escaped capture by the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, and in March 1945, they performed their most dazzling deception, misleading the Germans about where two American divisions would cross the Rhine River. To explore this story is today's guest, Rick Beyer, author of The Ghost Army of World War II, how one top-secret unit deceived the enemy with inflatable tanks, sound effects, and other audacious fakery. We'll look at how this traveling roadshow wielded imagination, paint, and courage to save thousands of American lives. Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Rick Beyer. Let's start off at the present and work our way back. The Ghost Army was awarded the 2022 Congressional Gold Medal, which is Congress's highest expression of what they describe as national appreciation for distinguished achievements and contributions by individuals or institutions. You were a major part of this effort. Could you tell me why you think it was so important for them to receive this recognition nearly 8 decades after the end of the war?
So here you have this World War II unit, this very secret World War II deception unit that's not honored for what they did during World War II, I think largely because it was secret. And so it was just kind of kept hush-hush. And I felt, having explored the story with a documentary and a book and more, that they were really deserving of some kind of recognition. And the Congressional Gold Medal has often been awarded to military units that were not honored in the time period for whatever reason, whether it's because of secrecy or racism or just being overlooked. And so I kind of set my sights on that. And I think it was 2015 when I started that effort. And I kind of remember thinking, well, this is something we ought to be able to accomplish in a couple of years. We've gotten so much attention for this already. And it took, I think, 7 years before it was finally passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. And the thing about a Congressional Gold Medal bill is, we already know it's hard to get Congress to do anything. But a gold medal bill is even harder because you have to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to co-sponsor the bill before it can even be considered. They have to put their names on it and say, hey, I'm for this. And so it was quite a lift over 4 different Congresses, but I'm thrilled that we got that done. And we're actually hoping that the final award ceremony will take place very soon.
Well, we'll see all the things they did to deserve this, and there are very many things, and what individuals did, in many senses, put themselves in more harm's way than typical troops, because other troops had tanks and armaments in order to prevent an enemy from easily attacking them. The Ghost Army had a lot of balloons and sound effects, and basically a militarized circus. But let's go back to the creation of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. This is in the middle of the war. Momentum is shifting toward the Allies, but it's before D-Day. Why did U.S. military strategists see a need for it? And what sort of problems do they want to solve that they didn't think could be solved with conventional warfare?
Well, surprise is very useful in warfare because it can give you the advantage over the enemy. It can create opportunities that are not otherwise available. And the 2 planners who kind of dreamed this up were 2 guys named Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And they were working at the U.S. Army headquarters in London as they're preparing for the Normandy invasion in 1943. And they're very different people. Billy Harris is a button-down West Point graduate colonel who will eventually become a general. Ralph Ingersoll is a dramatic, kind of left-wing publisher and author, kind of a very well-known person. And they're thrown together to work on this, and they develop this idea. And I think the reason that they develop it is because once Eisenhower lands his troops on the beaches of Normandy, they're going to be going up against the very best army in the world in the Nazis, and they are very concerned, especially in the early days, about not having enough soldiers on the ground. And so they want to have tools that they'll be able to use that'll be force multipliers. And the idea of a deception unit is a force multiplier because it can make it seem like you have more soldiers than you really have in a given position at a given time. So Ingersoll and Harris are kind of inspired by British deception efforts in North Africa. The British at the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, they disguise tanks to look like they're just supply trucks. They disguise supply trucks so that they look like tanks. They completely fool the Germans about where their attack is going to come. And I think the Americans see this as something that they want to try to employ. And so they developed this idea, which is really original and really hadn't been done, of having this deception unit really dedicated to deception. It's not just soldiers brought over for deception and then you put them back someplace else. A unit dedicated to deception that was multimedia, it would be visual in that you'd have inflatables, but you'd have other means of deception as well. And they kind of pitched this to the commanders. Eisenhower's not in command yet. Jake Devers is in command in the UK. And the commanders buy it as something, kind of a worthwhile experiment. Hey, if it goes wrong, it's only 1,000 guys. It's only 1,100 guys that we've had a problem with. But it doesn't go wrong. It ends up really working well for them over the course of the war.
Tell me about the people that Commander Harry Reeder selected. And there's a lot of future luminaries in this group, like a fashion designer, Bill Blass. There are painters, famous photographers, and collectively, the group had one of the highest IQs in the Army with an average of 119. So really impressive group. Who did he select and how did he select them?
Well, he didn't really select individuals. Now, there's a lot of amazing people in the Ghost Army, and they kind of get there in a variety of ways. But when this unit is formed in January of 1944, they've got 5 months before they're going to need to be in England and be ready for action. So they've got to move very quickly. So what the Army does is I use the expression that they Frankenstein this unit. They take pre-existing units and kind of put them together like Dr. Frankenstein assembling his monster. And so it's units that are being brought in. And one of the units that's being brought in to handle the visual deception with inflatable tanks and artillery and trucks, etc., is a camouflage unit, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. And that unit has a lot of artists in it because, of course, if you're going to do camouflage, it makes sense that you utilize the talents of artists. So most of these guys are young artists. I wouldn't say most in the unit, but the artists who are in the unit, they're mostly young. A bunch of them, about 30 of them, were graduates of Pratt Institute. So that's a core of people right there. But you've got people who went to other art schools as well. And so they are handling the visual deception. And that group includes Ellsworth Kelly, who becomes the famous minimalist painter and sculptor. It includes Bill Blass, the fashion designer, who's just a kid from Indiana with a big smile on his face, who's interested in creating a fashion empire after the war, which he does. And it includes Arthur Singer, who becomes a famous wildlife artist after the war. So those people get in that way. The only unit that really is able to select people individually is the sonic deception unit. And this is where we're going to be fooling the enemy using pre-recorded sounds. And that unit was put together a little bit separately from the rest of the Ghost Army. It started a little earlier. And so they were able to interview people and bring in only kind of the highest IQ people into that unit because they thought that carrying out sonic deception was going to be a bit of a mind game, and they really wanted people who were able to wrap their arms around it. So it's not so much Reeder picking individuals as that the groups that they brought in, had sort of a lot of spectacular people in them, especially that camouflage unit, but also the sonic. And then they had a signal company that was doing radio deception. That's a unit where they brought in this entire unit, the 244th Signal Company, and then they swapped out about 100 people in that unit that they decided weren't up to this deception mission and brought in a lot more high-speed radio operators. So you get some people who are brought in individually that way. But I think it's a little bit of a misconception to think of these guys as being individually picked. This is happening really fast. I mean, it's really, and there's a million other things happening. And trying to get this unit together, get it on ships, get it to Europe. I think if we looked at it today, if you ask somebody in the military, can you put this together in 5 months? They'd be like, no, it's going to take, 18 months or 2 years or something to train all those people and do it. And I think that's one of the glories of the story, is that they're able to put this together so quickly.
There's something ancient in this. Military deception goes back to Sun Tzu or in Aeneas Tacticus in Greece. But most of that is based on sending spies or coding messages. This is on a whole different scale in the 20th century. Now you have technology that makes for audio sounds, fake radio traffic. And I was about to say that it reminds me of a carnival, but I think it's more like a rock concert where you have roadies that are moving equipment around. You can have this roving spectacle. So it's a militarized Taylor Swift concert in a sense, where you have a lot of equipment moving, except it's under gunfire. So before we look at the individual battles and how they perform, can you tell me about the strategies that they developed, the inflatable tanks, the sound effects, phony generals, to try to put together these fake convoys and divisions and headquarters?
I like the idea of a rock concert. I always, frequently at least, describe this as a traveling roadshow. We're setting up to carry out a deception in one place. We're performing for a few days in this town, and then we're shutting down the show and driving someplace else and performing someplace else next week. They go to war with 3 types of deception. And the idea is they're going to use these 3 types of deception to fool the Germans in tactical situations about where a real unit is. So if the 75th Infantry Division is going to be attacking in one direction, the Ghost Army is going to impersonate them, getting ready to attack in another direction, so that when the 75th actually attacks, they can do so surprising the enemy. And to impersonate the 75th Division, in this case, they're going to have, first of all, inflatables. Inflatable tanks is kind of the most famous, but they had inflatables of anything that a infantry or an armored division would have. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery, spotter planes, any of those things that they can set up on very short notice to fool enemy aerial reconnaissance. But then they've also got radio deception. They can impersonate all the signals of a real division as it's moving in. And this can start from 50 miles away because radio carries a long way. So they can start the radio deception and move that in. And if you have the same number of radio operators as a real division, which is a relatively small number of people, you're going to make it seem to the enemy listening in like a real division is moving in. And they had sonic deception, which is using recorded sound to fool the enemy. They had 500-pound speakers mounted on the back of half-tracks. They could be heard 15 miles away. And so they can create this illusion that a unit is moving to a certain place on the front. And once they're in Europe, they develop a 4th type of deception, and it's known as special effects. And what this is it's to fool enemy spies who've been left behind. So it involves putting on the shoulder patches of the unit. And if they didn't have the real shoulder patches, they made counterfeit ones. It involves, going into town in a town and kind of talking loose to people. It involves bumper markings on trucks. It involves setting up phony headquarters for units, a phony regimental or division headquarters, and if you have a phony headquarters, you got to have a phony general, somebody who is, wearing 2 stars as commander of a division, who's in a Jeep, surrounded by guards with Tommy guards, who's coming in and coming out and doing stuff, all of this to fool enemy spies. And so the idea of all this is to give the enemy individual tactical situations a misimpression of what's going on so we can manipulate the enemy to do what we want them to do, to move troops to a certain place so that we can be successful. And they come to Europe with 3 kinds of deception. They add this 4th type of deception, and they use these in 22 different deceptions that start about a week after D-Day and go until March 1945 as we're getting close to the end of the war.
It's amazing that all of this worked, because before learning about the Ghost Army, I imagined moving an inflatable tank, and I thought this thing is about as agile and nimble as a bouncy house. Anyone who could spot it from far away would know something was off, the way that spotters, if they were seeing a soldier from miles away through binoculars, they could tell whether it was an American or a German, simply based on how they walked, their gait, how they were trained to march through different terrain. Clearly, it's more complicated than just dragging along an inflatable tank and it moving in a way that a tank never would, because the deceptions did work. So let's look at particular missions to see how they were able to successfully execute this. After D-Day, shortly afterwards, in June 1944, the missions begin. There are 21 different deceptions. Let's begin with Operation Bettenborg, where they hold Patton's line along the Moselle River. Tell me about this battle and what the Ghost Army does.
Sure, but let me first deal with your question about the inflatable tank, because it's an interesting question. That wouldn't the enemy be able to figure that out? Well, frequently they're setting these up at night so that hopefully the enemy is not going to see them being set up. And, you would camouflage your inflatables, because American troops camouflage their tanks frequently, their artillery, but you try to camouflage it badly so that maybe only a piece of it is sticking out, so that you're not giving the enemy the whole picture of, look, here's this big artillery piece, here's this big tank. It's a piece of the barrel or a little something. You've camouflaged it, but camouflage it badly on purpose. That's kind of part of the art of deception, is we're not giving the enemy the whole picture. We're giving them bits and pieces. And depending on the enemy intelligence officers and the enemy commanders to put together these little bits and pieces, we're feeding them through different channels and develop in their own mind's eye the picture of what they think the enemy is doing. So that's just a little bit of the kind of the depth that this involves. Operation Bettenborg in September 1944 comes after the Ghost Army has been carrying out deceptions for a couple of months. And it's really the first deception where they really put everything together and do it all correctly and really have an impact. And the tactical situation is that the battle for Normandy has come to an end. General Patton has raced across France with the Third Army, and he's reached essentially the border with Germany, between France and Germany, Luxembourg and Germany. And he is attacking with the Third Army the fortress city of Metz, and he's really pouring his troops into that. And as he does so, it leaves a hole in his line up north of him, about 25 miles wide. And he's got one small armored cav unit, a couple of hundred guys, kind of operating in this 25-mile zone, but it's basically a very dangerous gaping hole. And the Germans have been thrown back and they're disorganized, but they're starting to reorganize. And if they can get together and get through that hole, they could get behind Patton and cause him serious problems. And there's not any real unit that they can rush into that at that moment. So what they do is they send the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, and they come up to the line in Bettenborg, and they are going to be manning this 25-mile section of line, pretending to be the 6th Armored Division. So they're using inflatables. They're using sound effects. The Germans are across a river, so the sound effects are very effective, traveling across the water, convincing them of all sorts of buildup on the other side. They're running special effects, running radio deceptions. And this is supposed to last for 2 or 3 days, but there's a delay in the troops that they want to bring up to fill this area. And so it starts to stretch out to 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. So, and as it does so, it gets more and more dangerous for the soldiers of the 23rd, because the enemy is shifting troops. The enemy is patrolling on their side of the river. And they are really worried that they are going to be overrun by the Germans, who are going to figure things out. But finally, after about 7 days or so of holding this position, they are relieved by the 84th. I think the 84th Division comes in and takes over, and they're able to kind of slip away. And, did they prevent a German attack that could have gotten through and gotten behind Patton? I don't know. But I'll tell you this, I showed the documentary film, which talks about Operation Bettenberg a few years ago, and there was a guy there who'd been a tanker under Patton at this screening, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, I never heard of the Ghost Army, but I saw your documentary and I was a tanker, I was at Metz, and I'm wondering if this unit saved my life. And I think that that's the great effect that the Ghost Army had, is that they were, potentially saving the lives of people by preventing some, awful tragedy to befall them.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors. I think there's a whole nother layer of fear that they would have to be grappling with than a typical soldier, because a typical soldier at least has weapons that are equal, if not better, than their enemy. For the Ghost Army, all they have are 50 caliber machine guns. So the best they can do if they are attacked is an organized retreat. There's no way they can fight back. This is something that happens at the Battle of the Bulge, where they barely escape capture. Could you tell me what happens here and what sort of challenges they face?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that, and I think the guys in this unit, they talked a lot about being scared because, it takes a certain kind of courage, I think, to be carrying this out, knowing you're kind of whistling in the dark and hoping that the enemy doesn't figure out what you're doing and just completely overrun you. During the Battle of the Bulge, just before the Battle of the Bulge, the 23rd was carrying out a deception called Operation Koblenz, which was along the border between Luxembourg and Germany, pretending that the 75th Infantry Division was moving in. And they had been requested by the Corps commander in that area because he was just a little nervous that he was slightly under strength and wanting to present a stronger picture to the enemy. So they did this deception for several days and then started to move out. What they didn't realize is that they were doing this deception right in the spot where the Germans were planning a huge counterattack with 3 armies attacking the Americans. This is the famous Battle of the Bulge, and they, also known as the Battle of the Ardennes. And the Ghost Army is pulling out on December 15th, and the German troops attack basically at dawn on the 16th. And so they literally were right in the path of the German offensive. Had they stayed there 24 hours more, they would have suffered massive casualties and been in deep trouble. And they're pulled back. They're back in Luxembourg. And as this attack develops, it becomes clear that it's a major German attack. And I thought it was really interesting. Eisenhower is pulling troops from all sorts of places, cooks, typists, clerks, throwing them into the line, doing anything they can to stop the Germans. And here you've got 1,100 people who they've got a lot of trucks. You could move them to the front very easily. You could throw them into the line. But they don't do that. They, in fact, take the Ghost Army and move most of it back out of harm's way to Verdun. The only unit that they leave up near the front is the radio unit, and that's because they are going to carry out a deception to assist General Patton as he's sending his troops toward Bastogne. And they carry out a deception, radio only, called Operation Kodak, to make it seem as if the divisions that are headed towards Bastogne are headed about 90 degrees in a different direction. So they are, they're trying to fool the Germans as part of that effort. But the Battle of the Bulge is one of those stories for the Ghost Army that it could have been the end of the unit had their orders not called on them to leave the front line when they did. And they would have found out how pitiful their machine guns would be against, massed tanks and artillery.
Their most impressive deception was when they misled the Germans about where 2 American divisions would cross the Rhine River. How did they do this, and what did it mean for the eventual invasion of Germany and the end of the war?
So their last deception is their biggest deception, is their best deception, and that's Operation Viersen. And the 9th Army is going to be crossing the Rhine River as part of a movement by the 21st Army Group under General Montgomery. And the mission of the 23rd is to make it seem as if the 2 divisions of the 9th Army that are going to be crossing the Rhine River in one spot are actually crossing the Rhine about 15 miles to the south of that spot. Now, the Ghost Army has 1,100 soldiers in it, and usually they are impersonating units that are division size or maybe, a half a division. Here, they're going to be impersonating 2 divisions, and that's the equivalent of, say, 30,000 men. So they're trying to portray 30 times their own size, and they do it by working with other units. They work with some real bridging units. They work with some real anti-aircraft units. I think they even have a few tank units that are attached to them. And what they do is they're going to make it seem to the enemy like the 30th and 79th Divisions are getting ready to cross the Rhine River in this spot 15 miles below where the real crossing is. And they pull out all the stops for this. If you look at the photographs of this deception, they have hundreds of inflatables set up in the farmland around Anrath-Dulken, Germany. They are doing radio deception. They do multiple nights of sonic deception, making it seem as if troops are moving in. There's a building there now that I've been to. I was there a few months ago. That is one of the fake headquarters. There's a couple of buildings that are fake headquarters buildings that we've located in the towns of Anrath and Dulken, where they're setting up to fool any enemy spies who've been left behind. So they're really doing everything they can to carry out this deception. And when the operation actually takes place, Eisenhower is there, Churchill is there, Montgomery is there, all the brass are there, not to see the Ghost Army, but to see the actual crossing of the Rhine River. And it comes off with very few casualties. One of the people I interviewed for my documentary film said there were fewer casualties than if they were running a training exercise, because the Germans weren't expecting them to come in that spot. They were expecting them 10 miles to the south. And for this deception, they got a letter of commendation, which is the only official recognition they ever got in the war. And it's from General William Simpson, who is the commander of the Ninth Army. And it's a very funny letter to read because it's commending them without saying what they did. So it says essentially, this is a letter of commendation to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops who carried out a mission very vital and important to this crossing of the Rhine River and did so at a very high quality level and is very much appreciated. But it never says, what they're really being commended for. And they were told, a number of soldiers in this unit said, some of them wrote home, said that they had been told that they were going to be put up for a presidential unit citation, but it never happened. And I think the reason that didn't happen is entirely due to secrecy, because I think all of the reports from intelligence officers that are part of this crossing of the Rhine River suggest that the Germans really bought what we were selling them, that they really had moved their troops, and that it really did make a big difference. And some people would say that this operation all by itself justifies the existence of this unit, that they might have saved thousands of lives in this one operation. And that even if you wiped out everything else that they did, and they did other stuff that was really important, but even if you wiped that all out, that this would stand on its own as being worth the creation of this unit.
I'm curious what the soldiers themselves made of being a part of the Ghost Army. You interviewed a number of them for the first edition of the book, and then after it came out, this brought more people out of the woodwork who realized that the stories of the Ghost Army were being publicized, and they added their own stories, contacted you, and this led to the second edition. Talking to them, what stories stuck out to you, and what did they make of their experiences being a part of the Ghost Army?
Well, it's very interesting. When I think back to talking to people, the first time I interviewed soldiers in this unit was at their last reunion, which was in 2005, the fall of 2005. And I did a lot of interviews around that time. And what struck me immediately was that these guys were very humble about their wartime service. Some of them really wondered what they did had any impact at all. They weren't sure that, nobody said to them, hey, this deception was really successful, or this deception did this and that. They carried out these missions, and then they went back home and had a sense of wondering about how effective it had all been. I talked to one soldier Bernie Mason. And he said, nobody told me not to talk about it, but I didn't. Other guys had come back and they'd been on the front lines and they'd been in this battle and been in that battle. And what am I going to say? I inflated a lot of rubber tanks. He said, I decided to just kind of keep quiet about it. And I think it really, in a number of cases, it took, them seeing the documentary films, reading the book that Elizabeth Sales and I wrote, or reading other books that have been written about this to kind of come to the conclusion that, oh, wait a minute, maybe this was really important. Maybe what we did 60, 70, now 80 years ago really mattered and made a difference. I heard a lot of stories when I was working with veterans. One of my favorites is told by a man named Arthur Shilstone, and he was in the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. And the unit has crossed into France, and it's early on, and they're setting up their inflatables and just trying to kind of shake the dust off. And before they've set up the inflatables, they've put out a security perimeter, and around that, to keep prying eyes out. But somehow, a couple of Frenchmen on bicycles get through the security perimeter, and now Arthur Shilstone has got to shoo them away. And as he described this to me, he said, these guys were looking over my shoulder, and what they thought they saw was 4 GIs lifting up a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. He said, and then they're looking at me, and they're looking for answers. And I just said, hey, the Americans are very strong, and shooed them away. And there's other stories. I remember during Operation Bettenberg, Dick Syracuse was out. He was an officer with the Sonic Company. He was out near the front, and they're playing the sounds of tanks moving into this area. And then looming out of the darkness comes a colonel or a lieutenant colonel from the armored cavalry unit who's also operating in the same area. And he is enraged, and he says, "What the hell's going on here, son?" And Dick says, "Well, what do you mean, sir?" And he says, "Well, what the hell are all these tanks doing here? There's not supposed to be any tanks in this area." And Dick Syracuse, he's kind of at a dilemma at this point because not supposed to reveal their mission to people, but this is a senior officer who should really know what's going on. So Syracuse says, "Well, sir, there really aren't any tanks in this area." And he said at that point, the lieutenant colonel lost it and started filling the air with expletives, or as Dick, when he described the story to me, said explectives, using explectives. What the hell's going on? Don't tell me there's no GD tanks here. I can see the tanks and hear the tanks. And finally, he explained it to him. And the officer said, "Oh, well, son, you could have fooled me." And I always love this story because if you're fooling your own officers, you must be fooling the enemy as well. And Dick is a guy who said, he was a very down-to-earth guy. He became a developer in a New York area. But he said to me that on these nights when they're out playing these sounds, that after a while he could begin to see tanks, that it was, he knew they weren't there, and yet he started to see them. And he said it was psychologically unnerving. And those are a few. I mean, Scott, I can go on all day with stories if you want that, but those are a few that occur to me.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that for many of these soldiers, because the missions were classified, the wider public didn't know about that, it affected how they understood their own experiences in the wartime effort. And it's only in the 1990s that the Ghost Army becomes declassified. Why were these missions classified for so long? And when they're first revealed, what's the first reaction that the American public had to them? Scott here. One more break for a word from our sponsors.
So the Ghost Army's official history was classified after the war, and it stayed classified until 1996. And now I want to say that, and I deal with this in the book, there's a whole bunch of stuff about secrecy because it isn't completely solid. There are some articles and stories and some people who talk about it, but the Pentagon does kind of keep a lid on it. And there's an officer in the unit named Fred Fox who goes to work for Eisenhower's White House after the war. And then he wants to write about the Ghost Army, and he tries twice to get the Army to declassify this story, and they won't do it. So why is it so important to the U.S. Army to classify this and have it stay classified? And I think that there's a two-part answer. And the first part is that it was successful, right? Because if it had just been a failure, why bother classifying it? Because you're never going to use it again. But if it's successful, maybe we want to use this again. We've got a Cold War that's going on with the Russians. Maybe we want to use deception if that Cold War heats up at some point. So we're going to keep this a secret to preserve the ability to use it. Now, I think in the end that it's kept so secret that the Army sort of forgets about it. And they don't continue to have a strong deception capability. And they really rediscover the story starting in the 1990s. And there's some interesting examples of Ghost Army soldiers being called to come to the Pentagon to talk to the generals. Fred Fox, who I mentioned, ends up going to a lunch with the Joint Chiefs of Staff at one point. And some of the reports of those meetings and conferences are still secret. So not necessarily easy for me to find out exactly what they were telling the Joint Chiefs. But I think the result of this is that, as you mentioned, and as I touched on before, is that for a lot of guys, this was just something that happened in the war. It was kind of crazy. It was kind of weird. I'm just going to let it go. Maybe I'll tell my kids about it. Maybe I'll mention it, but I'm just going to kind of let that go. And so when we came around and started asking people, hey, do you want to talk about this thing that happened to you 70 years ago? Instead of getting the kind of response of, no, I don't, that you kind of get from a lot of veterans where they don't want to open up and talk about something, it was like, oh, yeah, I would love to talk about it because, for so long I haven't talked about it. And some of the guys, many of the guys had been told, don't talk about this for 50 years. And I know of soldiers who, were married and had kids and died, and they never told anybody. And their kids have reached out to me and said, oh my God, I just found out that my dad was in this unit. Can you tell me anything about his service? So that has been amazing. And as the story has gotten out through the documentary and through the book, we have had a lot of people who have donated collections of letters, who have kind of shown us scrapbooks and stuff that we hadn't seen before. And so really, even though the first edition of the book came out 7 years ago, we've learned a lot since then. And I'm hoping to continue to learn a lot, from families and from treasures that are left behind and that we can hopefully get a chance to look at.
With that in mind, studying them on the personal level, talking to the soldiers part of the Ghost Army or their family members, but also looking at them from a military strategy standpoint, what would you say is the legacy of the Ghost Army and their influence on the war effort when you were pushing for them to receive the Congressional Gold Medal? How did you describe the way that you think that they should be remembered and recognized?
Well, let me first of all say that they did not win the war single-handedly. That the war we would have won anyway had the Ghost Army not been there. So, we're not overstating what they did. But I think that this was a life-saving unit. I think that they saved thousands of lives of American soldiers. One of the guys I interviewed put it this way. He said, they say we saved 15 to 30,000 lives. But if we'd only saved 15 to 30 lives, it would be worth it. I think the legacy of the unit is that they kind of weaponized creativity and they put it into use on the battlefield, which I think is pretty extraordinary all by itself. And they did so for the purpose of saving lives, and that the unit saved probably not only American lives, but German lives, if you think about it. Because if you create a deception that avoids the pitched battle and allows our troops to get through with less of a pitched battle, it's fewer people on both sides who are killed in that circumstance. So I think it's a great example of creativity being put to use and creative people being put to use in a circumstance where we don't normally think of creativity happening. It's an example of Army planners thinking out of the box to create something really unusual. It's the first mobile multimedia tactical deception unit in the history of warfare, and then putting it to use on the battlefield. And so I think for all those reasons, and those are all arguments that I made when I sat in the offices of dozens of congressmen and senators trying to convince their staffs that this is something worthy of their attention. And, we haven't done it. The U.S. Army today does have deception planners and they do deception stuff, but we have not ever really put this into use on the battlefield, as far as I know, since World War II. But we retain the capability, and I think it's important for us to retain the memory of it.
Absolutely. And you've documented this in great detail with the stories you mentioned here, but also loads of pictures of the different devices, the inflatable tanks, and everything else used as part of the deception. So I think this really colors an understanding of the war that has been overlooked for a very long time. And for listeners who want to check that out, the name of Rick's book is The Ghost Army of World War II, How One Top Secret Unit Deceived the Enemy with Inflatable Tanks, Sound Effects, and Other Audacious Fakery. Rick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate the chance to be here.
All right, that is it for today. If you would like to see show notes for this episode, along with all my others, go to parthenonpodcast.com. That's the name of the podcast network that I'm a part of, along with James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other great history shows as well. If you'd like to support History Unplugged, the two easiest ways to do so are to subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. The second way is to join our membership program, and if you do so, you'll get completely ad-free episodes of the entire back catalog, which is 600 episodes and growing. Just go to patreon.com/unplugged. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.